Verse 228 reads, "Men have a status above women," which passage is the first of many slights against women in the Koran, and which passage introduces a topic on which we will have much more both to read and to comment just a little later on. We continue to read admonishments to fight here and there, and then round out the chapter in verse 282, where we read that it takes 2 female witnesses to equal 1 male witness, which passage is yet another slight against women in the Quran. The next chapter, number 3 in the Quran, is called the Imrams, a name that refers to the family of Jesus. In verse 15 of the Imrams, we read once again about those chaste virgin wives in heaven. And then in verse 32, we read for the first time the ominous, "Allah does not love the unbelievers." Contrast that passage in the Quran, that Allah does not love unbelievers, with Jesus' well-known teachings in the New Testament of the Bible, such as God so loved the world that he sent his only Son into the world, or God sends his rain on both the just and the unjust alike, or that we should love our enemies. And likewise contrast that Koranic passage, that Allah does not love unbelievers, with Buddhist teachings, this one from an internet version of the Metta Sutta, which says, "Radiate boundless love towards the entire world," and this one from X. Max Muller's seminal 1881 translation of the Dhammapada, which says, "Hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love." The name Allah used in this passage is the name of God in Islam, and this name corresponds to the early name of God in the Jewish Torah, which is the first part of the Old Testament of the Bible, which name is El, and which even sounds like Allah, especially in its poetic or expanded form, which is Elo, or in Jesus crying out to God on the cross, Eloi. And El was the God of Abraham, to which prophet and ancestor both the Jews and the Muslims make claim. Since, as the Torah tells us, the traditional ancient progenitors of those 2 tribes, Isaac and Ishmael respectively, were both sons of Abraham, who together buried their father at Mamre. So now we can understand that the political and social barbarism that accompany the worship of Allah in modern times parallel the political and social barbarism that the Torah tells us accompanied the worship of El in Abraham's time. Back again in the Imrams, this chapter then makes some actually refreshing references to the legitimacy of the Jewish and Christian religions. But then we come to verse 118, where we read, "Believers, do not make friends with any men other than your own people. They will spare no pains to corrupt you. They desire nothing but your ruin. Their hatred is clear from what they say, but more violent is the hatred which their breasts conceal." This passage tells Muslims how they should relate to all of us unbelievers. No matter how much friendship we show to them, their God and their prophet command them not to show friendship back to us. No matter how much we love them, their God and their prophet command them to regard our love as hate and not to love us back. Of course, we all know friendly Muslims, but by virtue of this passage, we know that such Muslims must either be living in ignorant or willful disobedience to the Koranic command not to befriend us unbelievers, or else be trying deliberately to deceive us. Verses 122 through 124 refer to the Battle of Badr, in which Mohammed himself led Islamic military forces, and along with them killed people with his own hands, at least some of whom had to have been innocent or unarmed, because they attacked a trading caravan, supposedly, as Muslims assert, to recover some lost or stolen Islamic money, but who knows for sure, in the desert just outside of Medina, before fighting the military forces from Mecca rushing to that caravan's aid. And then in verse 141, we read in reference to that battle, "If you have suffered a defeat, then so did the enemy." We alternate these vicissitudes among mankind so that Allah may know the true believers and choose martyrs from among you, and that he may test the faithful and annihilate the infidels. This passage gives Muslims not only a further affirmation of Allah's command to murder us infidels, but also a first inkling of the glory and special reward reserved for Muslims who fight and die in battle for Allah. Continuing in that same vein, we read in verse 147, "Many large armies have fought by the side of their Prophet. They were never daunted by what befell them on the path of Allah. They neither weakened nor cringed abjectly. Allah loves the steadfast." And then we read in verse 158, "If you should die or be slain in the cause of Allah, His forgiveness and His mercy would surely be better than all the riches they amass. If you should die or be slain, before Him you shall all be gathered." But in verses 170 and 171, we read the real clincher. "You must not think that those who were slain in the cause of Allah are dead. They are alive and well provided for by their Lord, pleased with His gifts and rejoicing that those whom they left behind and who have not yet joined them have nothing to fear or to regret, rejoicing in Allah's grace and bounty. Allah will not deny the faithful their reward." People who truly believe that they will be rewarded after death for fighting and dying in battle for Allah, as these passages suggest, will never be defeated militarily. So the only way that we can stop Islamic militancy absolutely is to persuade Muslims religiously, preferably by their own scriptures if that were possible, that killing infidels will land them in hell, not in heaven, and before the true God of love in heaven. That is the truth. I suspect that none of our Western world leaders really understands what a profound effect believing that God wants to reward you for murdering people has on Muslims, because none of our Western world leaders really believes in God, except as a means of getting votes. The next chapter, number 4 in the Quran, is called Women. In verse 34 of Women, we read, "Men have authority over women because Allah has made the one superior to the other." Did you catch that, ladies? The God of Islam and His followers consider you to be an inferior gender. Back to the passage again, "and because they spend their wealth to maintain them. Good women are obedient. They guard their unseen parts because Allah has guarded them. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them and send them to beds apart and beat them." Let me run that back by you again, ladies, just in case your minds were wandering just now. Mohammed and his God say that men should separate disobedient women and, quote, "beat them," end of quote. Back to the passage again. "Then if they obey you, take no further action against them. Allah is high, supreme." This passage does not say what are the next steps to be taken against women if beating alone does not change their behavior. But I suppose that the many executions of Muslim women by Muslim men that we see in internet videos gives us a good indication of what at least some Muslim men think that Allah has in mind. The Western women who think that they are being loving and liberal by accepting Islamic people into their homelands are fools for accepting a religion that commands men to beat them. And any woman who willingly joins Islam is a true masochist. Islam is the ultimate female-hating religion, as recently demonstrated by the rash of rapes and molestations by Middle Eastern Islamic men on native women in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. A Norwegian woman visiting the supposedly liberal Muslim country of Dubai was sentenced to 2 years in jail for adultery, just because she reported to police there her having been raped. Angela Merkel, the female Chancellor of Germany, has herself, of course, never been made vulnerable to such attacks by Muslims because she lives in her figurative ivory tower, protected behind high walls. But pity the common women in her country living in more humble abodes, whom she did make vulnerable to such attacks by encouraging the acceptance of Muslims into Germany, and by pretending like there is no difference between that religion and any other. Any person who supports women's rights must fight against the Koran, for the sadistic Koranic command to beat women for mere disobedience is the constant threat that our Islamic sisters live under. And even though most Islamic men would never dream of actually acting on such a command, since the average man, Islamic or not, is by nature much kinder than Mohammed ever was. Nevertheless, because Mohammed's command to beat women is forever etched into the stony annals of mainstream Islamic instruction, the potential for such violence in that religion will always remain. Back again in women, in verse 74, we read more about the heavenly reward for Islamic war martyrs, this time adding that they will be rewarded whether they win or lose their earthly battles, saying, "Let those who would exchange the life of this world for the hereafter fight for the cause of Allah. Whether they die or conquer, we shall richly reward them." And then in verse 76, we read more about the Islamic call to warfare, saying, "The true believers fight for the cause of Allah, but the infidels fight for idols. Fight then against the friends of Satan." In that passage, we also learn that, in Islam, pagan idolaters are associated with Satan. But in the Jewish and Christian religions, from which Mohammed borrowed his very idea of Satan, Satan is typically characterized as being a deceiver, which does not at all describe pagan idolaters, who simply are what they are, but could very easily describe Allah, who repeatedly in the Koran proclaims himself to be the compassionate or the merciful, but by his deeds and by his commands repeatedly proves himself to be anything but compassionate or merciful. Just like the difference between the benevolent self-proclamations and the contradictory malevolent deeds and commands of the two gods of the Old Testament, who are El and Yahweh.